The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Language is powerful, and during the political battles of this COVID era, that's been deployed by partisans and policymakers on all sides. How does rhetoric amplify, distort, or persuade when the fight is over rights? We'll find out. Then, has the pandemic forever changed the public's interest in blockbuster events and cinema? J.N. Jagannathan looks into that. It's Thursday, March 3rd, and that's next on The Agenda. Supporters called it the Freedom Convoy. Detractors called it the Ottawa Occupation. Everyone claimed the flag and the high ground. Whatever your stance, what became blindingly obvious was that during this pandemic, a war of words has been playing out in everyday conversations, social media, and of course in protests, big and small. With us for some perspective on the rhetorical battles past, present, and future amid COVID-19, let's welcome, in Montreal, Quebec, Justin Ling, freelance investigative reporter. In the nation's capital, lawyer Paul Champ. And in Markham, Ontario, Samantha Krishna-Pillay, founder and executive director of the social enterprise The On Canada Project. And in the provincial capital in North York, Kara Zwiebel, director of fundamental freedoms at the CCLA, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. And in Midtown, not too far from this very studio, criminal defense lawyer Tanya Kent. And we're delighted to have you all on our program tonight. We're going to dive right in, starting with the lawyer. So, Tanya, you're up first. There was never a law in Canada saying that you had to get a vaccination. But some people did have to. For example, people who worked in long-term care homes, some public servants, they were told they had to or they'd lose their job. Was that, in your view, a breach of their civil rights?
In my view, according to the law, it's not a breach of your civil rights. Because although the Charter, of course, has rights that are laid out, there's not a right to work in a particular place. So if you don't meet the requirements for that place, then you're not going to be able to work there. So, for example, if long-term care nursing homes are noticing there was a lot of deaths earlier in the pandemic in regards to COVID, then if there is a vaccine, it seems that in order to preserve life, people are going to then say, okay, well, the nurses or anyone who works in the home have to be vaccinated. So in my view, looking directly at the Charter, there's not a right necessarily that is being curtailed. It's simply what's happening is that if you're not meeting the current job requirements, then you just simply can't work there anymore.
Okay, Kara, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with a lot of what Tanya said. I think that there are complicating factors. You know, one of the things, especially when it came to the federal government's a mandate for their own employees, was that it was very broad. So we weren't talking about a group of employees that were dealing with, vulnerable populations. It applied to people even if they worked remotely. So that was hard to make out a sort of occupational health and safety justification. And so I think that there are questions about kind of the reasonableness of some of those requirements. But it is true, as Tanya says, that there isn't sort of a right to work in a particular place. And so I think certainly charter rights were implicated, but whether there was a violation is a lot harder to ascertain. And I think does depend a fair bit on kind of the specific details.
Okay, I'm going to get Paul to weigh in on this, in as much as we do have, of course, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but it also spells out that these are not absolute rights. There are some nuances and boundaries that come with them. Help us understand that.
Yeah, our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Steve, protect freedom of peaceful assembly and freedom of speech and expression and association. You know, in the context, I guess we'll start obviously talking about the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa. That means that, you know, although public streets and roads are primarily for traffic, they can, in some circumstances, be taken up by large groups in mass protests or demonstrations when people are protesting against issues involving the government or opposing the government. The question is, what is the limitation, or does someone have the right to block a road indefinitely, or in the case of Ottawa, block all of the downtown roads and blast horns that are at ear-splitting volumes day and night, and have trucks running 24 hours a day. So we do protect freedom of assembly and freedom of association, but the question is when do those freedoms go too far to infringe on the rights of others, and what's reasonable limits in the circumstances?
Do a quick follow-up. You asked the question, do people have those freedoms? What's your answer?
Yes, absolutely. I'm usually protecting protesters. I've acted on cases protecting people who are striking or engaging in protests. I've testified in Parliament about the right to protest, and that when people come together to protest, Steve, it doesn't matter what their issue is. I think we need to see that as a civic good. When people are organizing politically, that demonstrates the strength of our democracy. So when I see a protest, even if I disagree with what they're protesting, I generally will say that's a great thing, and is protected by our Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Okay, Justin, of course, the authorities have to balance the freedoms that we've just enunciated in the Charter, along with the impact that allowing those freedoms would have on the rest of society. In your judgment, you watched it. How well did the authorities do at balancing those two things?
I actually thought they did a pretty fantastic job, and I'm not somebody who's normally super complimentary of the way in which police manage to balance those rights. I think, generally speaking, police in this country definitely start from the point that all sort of disruption can be dealt with, with the heavy hand of the law. In this case, you had a city almost maybe going too far to actually kind of accommodate this disruption, this protest, this occupation. You had an effort by city police to kind of make a huge amount of space for this occupation. Now, some of that was done because there was a legitimate security concern. It wasn't so much about protecting their right to protest. It was also to make sure that no violence happened as a result. But generally speaking, the city and the police took a very hands-off approach and basically said, this is your right. We don't want to, use police powers to infringe on that. And that was basically the stance for a full, almost 3 weeks.
Samantha, just before I ask you a follow-up question, your social media enterprise on Canada, what's that about? Tell us what the mission is.
So our goal is to bring a compassionate and critical voice to give millennials and Gen Z the information they need to disrupt the status quo and champion change in Canada. Okay,
in which case, how did you approach some of the issues around free speech, around freedom of assembly that were attempted to be exercised in the case of the nation's capital?
I think, we approached it the way we approach pretty much everything that we do. We really believe that you can't be neutral or unbiased in situations of injustice because that means you're siding with the oppressor. So the project really unsubscribes to neutrality, and our tone in our content was very much like, this does not make sense. This isn't a violation of freedoms or of your human rights. You can't compare this to the Holocaust. Like these things don't equate. But then at the same time, we also deeply believe one of the large reasons as to why we're experiencing such a divide right now is like the result of an incomplete education. And that's not about like how many PhDs you have or how many degrees you have. It's more that our public school education is inherently incomplete because most of us didn't grow up learning about the way Canada oppresses people. Like I was not taught about the Indian Act in school. And when you don't have a proper definition or understanding of what these words mean, or how Canada has been oppressive in the past, it doesn't really allow you to talk about that. So that's what we unpack on our grid, as well as by being critical of systems and leaders and not towards everyday people.
Can I just do a quick follow-up with you here, Samantha? And that is, so much of this is in the eye of the beholder. Who, in your judgment, was the oppressor and who was the oppressed in the case of the Ottawa protests?
Yeah, I think it's more about what the convoy stood for. So I don't live in Ottawa, so it's hard for me to sit here and say like who was the oppressor and who was the oppressed. For that like individual event, it very much looked like the convoy participants were oppressive, but at the same point, by that same vein, like I also feel like there are a lot of people in that convoy who were maybe misled by organizers. Because there's a lot of people that I know that cared about what the convoy was standing up for. and didn't understand where the money was coming from, who had coordinated it, what sort of far right rhetoric was being like embedded throughout. So then I really feel like the leaders uphold that oppression.
Justin, who in your view were the oppressors and who were the oppressed?
I don't think you can frame it that simply. I mean, the reality is that the people who were occupying the city were certainly convinced that they were oppressed. They were convinced that not only were these vaccine mandates, these vaccine passports, these vaccine mask requirements, not only did they consider those oppressive and unconstitutional, they also kind of really saw it as a demonization of them by the federal government. And there is definitely some truth to that. The federal government, I think, went too far in some of the rhetoric around unvaccinated people. But there was definitely this victim complex that informed how they went about this. And when you live in this sort of victim complex that is so overwrought and so kind of unwarranted, it's kind of really hard to recognize the things you're doing that affect other people. And that's exactly what was happening. You did see them, laying on their horns, but making a mess of the city, harassing people in the streets, disrupting daily life, making it impossible to live downtown. But they always justify it by saying, no, we're fighting for your freedom too. So there was this real rationalization of the whole thing. So it's really hard to say whether there's oppressors or oppressees or heroes and victims here, because these people were fundamentally living in a different reality than the rest of us. They had convinced themselves so much that vaccines are dangerous, that the federal government was kind of conspiring to harm them, and that the rest of the country was just sort of blind to the injustices they were facing. And a lot of those beliefs were genuinely held. What we really need to focus on is the fact that the organizers, like we just mentioned, were misleading them and deceiving them and weaponizing them in many cases, for their own political ends.
Tanya, acknowledging that my frame may be a little overly simplistic here, if you had to say who the oppressors were and who were the oppressed, could you?
I don't think I could either. I think I agree with Justin in saying the same thing, is because each person, I think they're viewed as a block of people, and they're viewed as these people that are kind of like, we don't believe in the vaccine because of XYZ reasons. There are probably people that also are there because they've literally lost their jobs and don't have a way to live because they refuse to get this vaccine for whatever reason. It might just be they don't want to, it might be that they just don't believe in it. And it doesn't necessarily have to be so extreme. So those people who have lost their jobs are going to look at themselves as victims in the circumstance. But then there's obviously going to be, the leaders of the protests that maybe had different ulterior motives in the circumstances that I wouldn't necessarily view as victims, but I wouldn't take away the fact that there are some people in that group and some people that do truly believe that, because it's like, if they don't have a job, if they don't have a way to support themselves, then that is how they're going to view themselves.
Right. Paul, it might be useful at this point, just because so many Canadians get their information about their own civil rights from American law and order shows, to understand what the actual differences are between our Charter of Rights and Freedoms and their Bill of Rights. Could you compare the two?
Well, I mean, there are many similarities between the U.S. Bill of Rights and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The fundamental freedoms of freedom of expression, they call it freedom of speech down in the U.S., same thing. Freedom of press, freedom of association, freedom of assembly. There's all those fundamental freedoms. The main differences between the U.S. and Canada will usually come down to where we draw the limits. Because every society has to draw limits to freedoms. No freedoms can be absolute, because then if freedom is unlimited, you're necessarily going to be infringing on the rights of others. So the question is, how do you draw limits to those freedoms? The United States Supreme Court, has described the Bill of Rights saying, well, it's not a suicide pact, meaning you can't protect rights and freedoms as absolute, even if it means the destruction of your society. And that comes down to, that when we look at the pandemic, this is a great example of where a government has to, in some circumstances, restrict or limit some freedoms in order to protect the greater good. And I think that, it comes down to where governments and the courts will draw lines for different rights and freedoms. Sometimes actually Canada is more The Canadian courts are more permissive of some rights and freedoms. In the U.S., their courts and their constitutional history and jurisprudence grants, greater freedoms to freedom of speech, for example, than we may in Canada. But in large part, they're quite similar. They're quite similar, Steve.
Okay, well, let me get Cara to just do a quick follow-up on that, in as much as there is a clause in our charter which says you have all these rights as long as they are sort of reasonably practiced in a free and democratic society. In your judgment, does that draw the line too closely to a lack of permissiveness as opposed to, erring on the side of too much permissiveness or too many rights?
I mean, it all really comes down to how those limits are interpreted, eventually by our courts. I think that, what Section 1 of the Charter, the section that you're talking about, does is say, first of all, I think it's important that it puts the onus on government, right? It puts the onus on government to justify restrictions on rights and freedoms. And I think one of the difficulties and the things that we've struggled with a bit during the pandemic is that because we're in this situation, it's a tense situation. It's an emergency, or it has been an emergency and has had an urgent nature. And then we get to courts, and courts are typically going to be very deferential to governments when it comes to exercising these powers in emergency times, and especially when we're talking about things that involve complicated science that is continuing to evolve, and there's a lot of different factors. So I think usually we can go to courts and expect them to do a careful weighing and expect them to hold governments to a strict sort of standard of proof and say, okay, you've decided you can't get this many people together in a church. That sounds like a violation of freedom of religion. What's the justification for it? And usually you would expect, courts to require a fair bit of evidence and to apply it rigorously. I think during the pandemic, it's been easier for courts to be more deferential. And that's been frustrating for some people because the courts really are kind of our last resort. So I think that that section of the charter can be used in lots of different ways. It can allow for a very broad understanding of our rights, but in other times it can be used to really give the government an almost blank check about what constitutes reasonable when we're dealing with these very difficult circumstances.
You're mentioning that reminds me of a conversation I had not too long ago with a high-ranking official in the Catholic Church here in Toronto. And he said to me, I really don't understand government exercising its powers in a way which allows people to go to strip clubs but not to church. Anyway, that's another discussion for another time. Justin, let me get you back in here because you were live tweeting from the streets of Ottawa when all this was going on. And here's one of the tweets that you put out on the issue of police intervention. All told, you wrote, this situation was a logistical nightmare. Thousands of occupiers who refused to leave, with some ready to fight officers. Trucks and campers that may contain weapons, indeed at least one did, and a significant presence of children and elderly folks. Now, from your observation, how did the message and the demands of the protesters evolve over that nearly month-long time that they were either in or occupying, use the language you prefer, downtown Ottawa?
Yeah, so a good place to start is probably exactly what Cara was just talking about, because there was this deep frustration in the way in which governments were going about managing this pandemic. And this is a frustration that I'm sure everyone at home experiences to varying degrees. The fact that governments were allowed to shut businesses, shut churches, impose a curfew in the case of Quebec. There was this real frustration. And especially from people who maybe don't understand our constitutional order as well, there's this feeling of how can they do this? How are the courts allowing this? And I think you saw people sort of grasping at something that would help them explain the fact that this isn't legal, that would help them, justify the fact that the government isn't allowed to do this. And you saw this casting about for some document or in some cases magic words that would help them do that. So you've seen this effort from some individuals, from some organizations and activists to say that international law forbids this sort of thing, or that the Bill of Rights, because Canada has its own Bill of Rights that isn't used as often, but we have our own Bill of Rights, and some people said, well, the Bill of Rights prevents this. In some cases, you even saw a former Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, Brian Peckford, who claims to have written the Constitution, which is an overselling, but he says Section 1 doesn't actually apply unless unless we're in emergency or a war, and therefore Section 1 doesn't allow for governments to do some of these measures. Well, whatever the reason, a bunch of these groups got together and said, well, we're going to make a stand and we're going to stop the government from performing these illegal actions, specifically vaccine mandates. So when they got to Ottawa and when they started making these demands, everything came from this place where they were so convinced that they had the law, the Constitution, and human rights on their side. And when you believe that you are truly standing up for the legal order, international law, and the very founding documents of our country, it's very hard to be told that you're wrong. It's very hard to say yes when someone asks you to leave. It's very hard to try and negotiate in good faith because the rest of the country, the courts, the actual constitutional lawyers, the actual folks who administer our democracy are saying, no, you have this all wrong. But this group is sitting there kind of convinced they're right. It creates this impossible impasse where maybe it was a failure of our civics lessons earlier on. Maybe it's the fact that these conspiracy theories and misinformation have gone so far and done so much harm. Maybe it's the fact that governments did a bad job of communicating with these people. Whatever the reason, it made for this impossible, intractable problem.
Let me pick up on part of that with Samantha, and I guess one of the things we learned during the course of the whole convoy issue and the, again, protest/occupation of downtown Ottawa was that words really packed a different kind of punch this time than they had in the past. Like basic words, freedom. Freedom became a trigger word or a weaponized word. Democracy, we've already talked about oppression or oppressors. These words all took on meanings with much more baggage. And I wonder if, given that you're all about the social movements, can you talk to us about the significance of how just simple words can be either weaponized or used in these circumstances?
I'd love to. But I also want to note that I think that there's an important discussion to be had around how come there's such a misunderstanding around our Bill of Rights or Charter of Rights, around what is allowed by our government to do and what not to be allowed to do. I think that's a huge issue that needs to be unpacked. But to your question, I think before I understood how problematic the components of the convoy were, whether it was, their leaders, its origins, the funding that came through for it, and then eventually their actual actions in Ottawa, I was just really frustrated and hurt from the language used by these participants around oppression, violation of freedoms, and comparing, what they were experiencing with actual acts of oppression and violence, such as like Jewish people in Nazi Germany. And I really wanted to listen with compassion, but that's hard to do when the language they were using was just inaccurate. It wasn't reflective of the actual situation they were in.
Can I be blunt about this for a second? Here's my sort of blunt reading between the lines here. Did you have difficulty seeing a lot of white men claiming to be oppressed?
Yeah, I was going to say it. That was my next little piece there was 100%. It's super frustrating as a woman of color to see a bunch of white people stand around and scream about oppression when I'm not saying that there aren't marginalized white folk that are experiencing oppression, but you can't call a vaccine mandate that. It's just not accurate. But I will also say that on the flip end of this, I was also really frustrated about how neutral some of the language around talking about this was in our media, by our leaders. There was a blatant, there were such inequities around Black and Indigenous-led protests, how those are treated by the police, and then how this was treated by, how these white folk were treated by the police. And there wasn't really an ongoing discussion around that, which also hurt, which also felt really wrong. There are Black and Indigenous-led protests around our country where they're swiftly met with violence and harm. But in Ottawa, law enforcement was collegial with the protesters. Perhaps not at the end, but we all saw them using it as a photo op and all that stuff happening. I didn't see any photo ops in Fairy Creek. That doesn't make sense to me. And I think I just keep going back to what is oppression actually, and why haven't we been taught that? And that's what I think needs to be a bigger discussion right now.
Well,
but
at the
just
risk
in
of
general, not on.
sure, at the risk of getting it overly personal here, Justin, let me bring you back in, because you're a white male, but you're also a member of a minority group that has been long oppressed for decades in the past in this country, and maybe to a certain extent even still today. You want to weigh in?
Yeah, absolutely, because I think there's a real, I mean, first off, Samantha's point is exactly right. Police responses to Black Lives Matter protests, to Indigenous encampments, to homeless encampments, in almost every single case over the last decade has been infinitely more severe and judicious than this has been. And I think it's time we start having the police act more like they did in Ottawa over the past month for all types of protests, as opposed to having a more heavy-handed tear gas-centric approach be the norm. So that's important to underline. But also, what was particularly offensive about this occupation is that the leadership had been some of those advancing the ideas that trans people shouldn't have basic rights, or that the very concept of trans people does not exist. They have advanced horribly Islamophobic conspiracy theories and hateful messages. One of the chief organizers, who was constantly facing the public, telling everyone how moderate he was, Benjamin Ditchter, is a guy who testified before the Ontario Provincial Parliament that the Canadian National Association of Muslims was presiding over the Islamification or Islamization of Canada. You have individuals who have promoted the white genocide myth, popular with white supremacists. You've had individuals deeply involved in the organizing of this occupation who have advocated for the government oppressing people. For them to turn around and pretend to be the aggrieved minority is just too rich in many respects. And I know that a lot of people living in Ottawa, queer people in the queer community, people who are racialized, were sitting there just gobsmacked that these people were taking over their city, and then in some cases they were getting, kid gloves in the media, and there was this effort to both sides the conversation. It was very offensive for a lot of those people.
Paul, I know you like to go to bat for protesters, but what do you think of what Justin just had to say?
I think what Samantha and Justin both said are very bang on. I know that, in Ottawa in particular, we have seen the police take a much stronger hand with protests. For example, in the fall of 2021, there was a protest around policing in Ottawa. We've had a big dialogue around policing in Ottawa of racialized people over the last few years over carding. There was a very high-profile death of a racialized man by a police officer, and a high-profile trial. Once that officer was acquitted in the fall of 2020, there's been all kinds of protests. And one of those protests, I think it was like October 2021, there's a group of about 30 or 40 people assembling, and they took over a intersection in downtown Ottawa. Well, the police cleared them out in about 12 hours and arrested them. And so there has been a lot of talk about selective policing and how the police kind of rolled out the red carpet here for these protesters. And the fact that these protesters were almost completely white, it wasn't lost on anyone, from racialized communities who protest for racial justice and so forth. So I think those are very valid comments. I think Justin's point that, in some ways, the way the police handled this, because for the most part they were opening and even-handed, and even when it came time to break up the protest, I think they used tremendous restraint and professionalism. I watched it closely all day. I was inside the security cordon. I was going through, for days, like 3 or 4 police road checks just to get to my office. And on the whole, I thought the police did a tremendous professional job, and there was almost no injuries or uses of force. And the question is, why can't they use that sort of approach for other protests? When it's people who are, who we really understand, who are truly oppressed in this country.
Kara, let me get you to follow up in this regard. We clearly have different definitions of what constitutes freedom. We have different definitions of what constitutes oppressors versus the oppressed. I mean, we've been talking about it for the last 20 minutes here, about how different sides just can't seem to get on the same page with defining the same words. What do we do about that?
Well, I guess I totally agree with, with this discussion around how difficult it is to watch people who have and are used to having all the privilege in society talk about feeling oppressed. I think to be very generous, maybe to that and to try and shift the language a bit. I think what we're actually seeing is people who are, unlike racialized communities and Indigenous communities, people who are not used to having the weight of government and the scrutiny of government on them have been experiencing that during the pandemic. We've not. I'm not someone who's used to seeing the police in my neighborhood, but I took a trip a few days ago and I've had 6 calls from Health Canada since I returned. Those types of scrutiny are, of course, there's nothing to compare it to the types of atrocities that, people waving flags and things like that are doing. But there is, I think, there's a difficulty in giving voice to this idea that that all of a sudden I don't like the government paying this much attention to me. I don't like police paying this much attention to me, and so I think it's experienced as oppression, even if it's not objectively the kind of oppression that we, that we're talking about, with historical atrocities. I don't know. I mean, it seems sort of glib to say we need to be empathetic. And I appreciate that, especially with some of the people that were involved in really disruptive and in some cases harassing and intimidating and assaultive behavior. It's hard to be empathetic. I don't think I've spoken to a person recently who isn't having a very difficult time with the 2 years that we've had in one way or another. I think we're all struggling with it in different ways and recognizing many people have had it much better than others. So I don't know where we meet. I know that a lot of the division, I think, that is fed in some cases by social media, it is really not helpful. And I think also sort of as much as I think it's important to have these conversations and to call out, what's really going on and to call out people who are very privileged, who are talking about how oppressed they are. I also think it's not a good idea to just cast aside concerns that are being raised. I think that, and the government did do a lot of this. They did do a lot of vilifying of people who were skeptical of vaccines. All levels of government, I think, did that. We had for the first time in Canada, we had provinces saying, I don't want people from another province coming in here. They've got lots of COVID down there in Ontario. We don't want you coming to the Maritimes. I mean, we've turned against each other in a lot of ways. And so I think we need to get away from that. And one of the things that the Emergencies Act requires is that the government hold an inquiry. And the Act is very general about what's required. But I hope that it will be an inquiry that is really broad and meaningful and public, and that maybe we can air out some of these issues and use that as an opportunity to patch up some of the places where we've seen divisions and cracks.
Tanya, help us air out some of these issues here, because when you hear words like oppressor or oppression or freedom or democracy used in a way beyond our normal understanding of those words, how do you think that helps shape our understanding of our civil liberties and of our right to protest and so on?
Well, I think, first of all, that the Canadian public in general is not very educated on what the rights are in our charter, actually, and they get a lot of their information from TV. For example, I did want to mention this, is that when we're talking about the charter, I don't know, everyone knows about ride programs, when the police can just stop you and approach you to see if you're drinking or not. That's actually a breach under Section 9. But what they decided in that court case was that Section 1 trumps that because the dangers of drinking and driving on the street. So I compare it to something like this, where sort of the police are, where the court is saying, look, yes, this might be some sort of breach if we think about it, but however, there's an issue of safety going forward. So I think when people think about freedom and oppression, there's a lack of understanding of the basics of your rights in the first place and understanding those things. So I think it's really difficult to get people to understand about those types of words, because now these words have been used in like very strange ways. But I think that we have to get back to the basics of people understanding that. And I think that comes back to educating people on our legal system and educating people on the actual charter, and not just people kind of watching Law and Order or watching Blue Bloods or something. And that's where I think people are getting their information from.
Dick Wolf is not a great constitutional scholar, right? Right. Okay. With a few minutes to go here, Samantha, I want to go back to you because you wrote an op-ed piece recently entitled PostConvoy. And here's a quote from that. When we look at this convoy and think about the last few years, how will Canada know better and do better? How will we disrupt the status quo and build a Canadian narrative rooted in truth, reconciliation, healing, and inclusive growth? Great questions. You got any answers?
I mean, I think it's important. I get really frustrated when I hear us talking about healing a nation, when as if like the only divide that this country has ever seen has been like through this pandemic. The divisions in Canada and the inequities in Canada predate the pandemic. It stems from when Europeans first violently colonized Canada, and it stems from the violent and inhumane slave trade that Canada participated in to build white fortunes and for both individuals and for countries. You can't separate like dismantling white supremacy and healing our country, because those two things are not two separate problems. They're deeply intertwined, and just focusing on the division of the white supremacist-led convoy and the pandemic, while not holistically and sustainably addressing the divisions in our country that predate the pandemic, is honestly kind of racist. And that's really what I want to see Canada do, is, enact the cheat sheet, which is the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Report, to actually create policies around Islamophobia, preventing Islamophobia in Canada, and to like doing more for Black Canadians and Black folk in this country. Like there's so much systemic hurt and pain and issues in this country that are not being addressed and not being seen every day in the same way that the convoy was. And I'm tired of feeling like people who look like me or people with similar experiences to me or people who are also oppressed are less important. So if we want to heal Canada, we have to start from where we were first hurt, not from where we've most recently felt pain.
Understood. I want to thank the five of you for coming on to TVO tonight and sharing your views so thoughtfully and so civilly. We need more civil conversation in this country. So, all good. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
With 2 years of virtual film festivals and straight-to-streaming releases, the movie industry took quite a hit during the pandemic, as it also permanently altered what moviegoers want and how they want to consume it. With us now on that, from London, Ontario, Selma Purach, Professor of Media Studies at Western University, and in the provincial capital, Barry Hertz, Deputy Arts and Film Editor for the Globe and Mail, and Deanna Wong, Executive Director of the Toronto Real Asian International Film Festival. Welcome to everyone. So Deanna, I'm going to start with you. Being an independent, community-based collective, how has the Real Asian Film Festival been doing over the past 2 years?
Well, we coped like every other film festival in the world. We moved everything online, and we did our best to recreate what it is that people like about coming to our film festival, which is not just watching the films that we program, but having an online, an opportunity to speak with each other, talk about the films we've seen, and we did that by using the platform Discord, where we would set up channels where people could come. We did attract hundreds of people to talk about things that they'd seen, but it's just not the same as standing in the lobby afterwards or going to a reception and really getting a chance to talk to one another.
Now, Barry, you wrote an article on TIFF Lightbox coming out of a difficult winter. How do you see independent cinemas dealing with coming out of the pandemic, say, versus some of the bigger chains like a Cineplex?
Well, the bigger chains, have a huge advantage because they have those kinds of big blockbuster titles that audiences really want to see and have shown that they want to see. I mean, as you said, Spider-Man was a savior for Cineplex this past quarter, making more money than almost any other movie in 2021 combined. And independent cinemas, that's not part of their programming, nor should it be. So they have a huge challenge in how to convince audiences to come out for lesser known titles, smaller budgeted titles, more kind of art house fare that over the course of the pandemic, they've kind of been conditioned to expect to watch online with much more convenience.
Is there something that TIFF Lightbox is doing this season that's a little bit different, trying to get people out?
I would say so. I think that they've revamped their Cinematech membership, or rather their whole membership policy, in which you get not only a bunch of perks for discounted tickets on regular titles, but free admission to all their Cinematech programming. So any of their retrospective series, any of their kind of really art house kind of programming, and that's huge. That's upwards of 250 films a year. So there's that. They've revamped their regular programming. There's a new programming team in place. They're really trying to make it a much more inviting, only experience in the Lightbox kind of adventure, if you will. This is something you can't get at home. This is a conversation you can have with others in person. You're with fellow cinephiles. It's really kind of adding to the experience of making sure you actually get inside of the building and off of your couch.
Now, Selma, a lot of people, and myself included, have spent a lot of hours sitting on the couch, watching films and TV shows, and I'm going to say my appetite for what I'm into has changed. How has the pandemic sort of shifted the appetite of film goers and TV goers?
Well, I think that viewership itself, people are still watching a lot of entertainment, but what has really shifted is the way in which we access that content. So it comes down to that question of whether or not we access it digitally or, of course, theatrically. And one of the things that we've noticed is that this trend towards digital viewership was already in place prior to the pandemic. So 2019 was the first year where digital revenue overtook the total revenue from theatrical releases globally. So we've kind of established that pattern, but I think being, as you say, forced to watch content from the comfort of our couches has created an appetite to get out there, to be amongst others, and to share that love of cinema in like a live environment.
Barry, I want to talk a little bit on the production side. Are we seeing more or less content being filmed and produced by creatives?
Much, much more. I would say, even looking at local Toronto production houses and studio space is highly in demand. The GTA is just bursting with productions that are trying to get their cameras rolling, and crews are very hard to come by. There was a fear at the very beginning of the pandemic, of course, when everything shut down. They're like, oh my God, we're never going to be able to get more than like 10 people in a room together to make a movie ever again. What are we going to do? But very, very quickly, quicker than almost any other industry, film production bounced back. And with the kind of acceleration of streaming and viewer habits, the streamers have really gone all in investing in content, original productions that they need to kind of feed those subscribers and attract new subscribers. So really there's more stuff being made now than almost ever before, I would say.
Deanna, on that note, are you seeing that reflected in the submissions for your festival?
We had more submissions than ever in 2020 and 2021. I think part of it, partly last year, what it was people in 2020 were holding back their productions, finishing them, hoping that there would be the opportunity to go back in theater and back in on the festival circuit. And so there was a glut, but we had already, I think with changing technologies, we were already experiencing a lot more submissions from independent filmmakers. So yeah, content production was not a problem for us then. We were just wondering what's going to happen this year.
Selma, I'm curious, how much is our interest in films shifted or changed because of our lack of access to, movie theaters?
Not much, in fact. And I think that the fact that viewership in terms of streaming services has gone up really attests to that sustained appetite for entertainment, and really reaffirms what the other two guests have mentioned already. Like, the demand for content is absolutely there. And though the way in which we're accessing it might have changed, we still have that desire for the material.
Barry, do we see any sort of change as we start to move later into this month with mandates and sort of capacity limits being lifted and movie theaters reopening? Do we see a change in sort of our interests and how we consume film?
I hope. I think audiences have really been very slow to come back, unless they're kind of those kind of hardcore, comic book superhero blockbuster people. I think we'll see a lot more of those come out with the release this weekend of the new Batman film. But will they be coming out for a release of a higher budget drama or a comedy or something else that doesn't involve comic books? I don't know. A lot of older audiences were really scared away by the pandemic and have been very cautious to come back. And lifting capacity restrictions, lifting vaccine passports, while great from a business perspective, I don't know if it bodes well for consumer confidence, which is what the theater market really needs right now. So I hope to see it tick up, but I do feel that it will be a slower climb.
Now, we've already mentioned a few superheroes, so I think it's fair that I pull up a stat about superhero films. So in November 2021, 23% of internet users in the US said they enjoyed superhero movies, but were getting tired of the high quantity. Deanna, with superhero movies like Spider-Man and Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, which I feel like was the big 2021 movie for me, how do independent films offer, what do they offer that blockbusters don't?
Well, actually, what I was going to say to your mentioning of those two films, I've been wondering about the way audiences consume films in the theater, young audiences, movies like that. Because I remember, when I was a kid and Star Wars came out, kids would go and see that film 20 times and over and over again. And I realized that back then there were fewer options. But even my own kids who loved Spider-Man, when I asked them if they wanted to go see it again, they said, no, I've already seen it. And it wasn't, and to me, I thought, well, I would definitely see a movie again in the theater for that experience of watching a blockbuster film with an audience and having the opportunity to, it really does add to your experience to hear other people's reactions.
I want to pull up another stat here. As of September 2021, the big 5 major film studios, we're talking Disney, Paramount, Sony, Columbia, Universal Studios, and Warner Brothers, collectively held over 80% of market share in the US and Canada. Selma, how does the market concentration in the film industry impact filmmakers and creatives?
Well, I think the real game changer in this respect, it goes back to the world of like VOD and streaming platforms. With the pandemic, streaming services kind of became a lifeline for many independents. The emergence of niche services like Shudder, for instance, have helped art house and genre titles get made, either by buying indie films or by financing their own films, like allowing for a wider viewership. So I think for my generation of viewers, I very much appreciate the theatrical experience. Cinema is a communal experience. But for the younger generation, digital content, streaming entertainment, that's become completely normalized for them. And yet the access that we have to these streaming platforms has kind of shifted the game.
Barry, I'm hoping you can pick up on that. Do you think the pandemic has made people more inclined to choose TV versus film?
100%. Yeah. I mean, we also have to recognize that screens are everywhere. in our lives right now. They're no longer a treat. It's no longer a special event to go and see a film on a big screen. We have a screen at our beck and call at any moments of the day. And I think the pandemic kind of push that idea a little bit forward and put a light bulb in people's heads a little bit brighter that said, well, why do I have to pay X amount of for a ticket and concessions and parking and babysitting to go out when I have this avalanche of content sitting right in front of me that I can watch on my couch or in my washroom or on my bed or while I'm cooking. And we have to realize that I think filmmakers have to either really realize the shift that has happened in the consumer mindset, and also going back to that superhero statistic. If superhero films are really the only thing that's making money right now, and fatigue is indeed setting in, as it will inevitably with any genre, we have to really start thinking, Hollywood has to start thinking about what's after superheroes, what is going to help sustain this business once that interest dies down.
Deanna, I'm not asking necessarily for a pitch here, but there is value in a curated collective filming viewing experience. Can you tell us about that, versus, sort of the convenience of the screens right in front of you? What do people get from that curated film festival?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there is curation happening on platforms like Netflix, where you can choose to watch Asian content. But what you get from independent film festivals, niche film festivals, if you will, like ours, is the opportunity to watch films that have been curated for you, but watching them with an audience of like-minded people that have experienced the same experiences you had. I think one example I want to give you is years ago I saw a film called Even the Fire Horse. It's a Canadian film. I saw it at TIFF in an industry screening with a bunch of critics, and you could hear a pin drop. There was no reaction, and I left the theater thinking, honestly thinking maybe that film wasn't as good as I thought it was. But then a few months later, I saw it on opening night at the San Francisco Asian American Film Festival with 400 plus people in the audience, and there was so much laughter at moments throughout the film, and recognition of very specific things that were depicted, of families cooking and making dumplings, that sort of thing. That it's something that was a rarity back then, and is still a rarity even now. It's getting better, but that's what Real Asian does every November, is we give our audience a chance to commune. And we found that long-time audience goers, people that have been with us for the past 20 years, a lot of them didn't bother coming to watch online, because what they like about our festival is that communal experience.
I want to shift gears a little bit to award season, which seems to range from January to December, it seems like. I want to read a quote here. This was an excerpt from a Bloomberg newsletter published last year, and it reads, "Award shows no longer feel special. As soon as the Oscars started collecting millions of dollars for broadcast rights, opportunists decided to turn a couple of award shows into award seasons, a never-ending cycle that runs from the film festivals and the Emmys in the fall, through the Guild Awards and the Globes in the winter, to the Oscars later in the new year." Selma, it seems like we are watching the death of award shows in real time. How do we make sense of that? Are people as interested?
Well, I think the thing to remember here is that Hollywood has long revolved around this kind of fantasy of escapism. But even prior to the pandemic, we were seeing cracks in that fantasy. So the issue of diversity, of course, the number of sexual misconduct scandals, most notably the scandal with Harvey Weinstein. Movements like Me Too, Time's Up, and the BLM movement were all resonating within Hollywood. And I think that the taste for celebrating the industry was really waning when the pandemic hit. And so that waning interest was really amplified by the pandemic. Accordingly, the Oscars in 2021 were the least watched Oscars in history since we've been tracking numbers. And that trend seems to have continued into 2022 with Sundance going online, with the Golden Globes being downsized to a non-televised event, not just because of COVID, but also because of diversity boycotts. It'll be interesting to see what happens with the Oscars, which have been delayed to later this month. The theme is Movie Lovers Unite. But of course, they've shortened the ceremony by not live broadcasting about 8 categories. So things like makeup, sound, editing, animated short, which has caused some controversy. So I think we're experiencing this kind of waning interest at the moment. But as the industry begins to bounce back, I think that interest will return. Should award shows kind of return to that, the structuring themselves as a great event for audiences. At this point, our appetite for it is really not there.
Barry, I'm going to give you the last word here. As audience and consumers, is the fate of film and cinema in our hands?
Completely. I mean, supply meets demand. This, you show what you like and show up at the box office with your hard-earned dollars, and more of that will continue to be produced. So if audiences, see quality films and show up for them, then Hollywood will respond in kind. As for the Oscars, I mean, they need to really show that this is a kind of very special event, something for movie lovers. And the problem with last year was that very few of the films that were nominated had actually been seen by audiences. It's a little bit better this year, and I imagine that going forward it'll be a little bit better as well. What producers and the rest of us have to recognize is that the Oscars are not something that really needs to be trimmed back or very tailored or move fast. Movie lovers are going to watch it, and they're going to want to watch as much of it as possible. And we turn in for those very human moments where we can see triumph and celebration and the underdog and everything that we go to the movies for. So it's all part and parcel of the same thing, and audiences ultimately are in charge of film's destiny.
A lot of power there. Barry, Deanna, Selma, I want to thank you so much for joining us on the program tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, March the 3rd, 2022. Ontario's proposing a new minimum wage policy for gig economy workers, and Nam Kiwanuka will look into that tomorrow. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and Nam, we'll see you here tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.